Secondly, again, before even delving much into this, I want you to know just again that this was a school of thought that really fell into eclipse after the 1930s, after it had made very important contributions to the field of economics at the turn of the century. And then it sort of fell into eclipse. It really was not saying what the powers that be wanted them to say. And then all of a sudden, out of the clear blue, 1974, F.A. Hayek wins the Nobel Prize. And he wins it for precisely the very thing that brings us here tonight. For trying to explain why it is that economies move in this boom-bust pattern. Why? Is that just the way the world is? That just God ordained this, and that's just how it goes? Or might there be some natural explanation that we can appeal to? That's Hayek's contribution. He's trying to answer that question. He wins the Nobel Prize for this in 1974. He did the work on it in the 1930s, so they were a little slow in getting around to him, but by the 1970s he wins this prize. So that naturally brings about a bit of a renaissance in studies of the Austrian school, but then that sort of faded out. And then now it's just to the point where people are talking about it like crazy. And it's still slow to penetrate into the textbook. Textbooks are always the last books on earth to incorporate anything that's going on. I mean, you could read a lot of American history textbooks. It's like the scholarship of the last 50 years never occurred. They're always the slowest. But investment analysts, investment conferences, all these people who actually have real-world experience with financial markets are very interested in what the Austrians are saying about why the economy moves the way it does. And in particular now, we have this issue involving an economist named Paul Krugman. Now, some of you may not know who Paul Krugman is, which means you are enjoying a much more tranquil life than I am. But Krugman was, in fact, the Nobel Prize winner in 2008. So, you may say, well, then what's the big deal about an Austrian winning it if this guy you don't like wins it? Hayek, as we'll see, wins the prize for saying the opposite of what the committee wanted to hear. So that is rather an achievement. Krugman wins the Nobel Prize. He's a New York Times columnist as well. And he, to the extent that he has deigned to acknowledge the existence of the Austrian school, it has been for purposes of ridicule or to misstate what it says. And it just repeatedly misstated it. So now a friend of mine who has a PhD from NYU, his name is Robert Murphy, is challenging Paul Krugman to a debate. So this would be an extraordinary event where we finally get to hear some competing views. You know, it's supposed to be a free society. This is supposed to be what we're all about. We get to hear some competing views. And you might think, well, won't Krugman just say, well, I don't want to debate you. You're just some crumb, and I'm Paul Krugman. You know, look at me. But my friend's a clever guy. He's a clever guy because the way he's done this is he's using a website called The Point. And you go to this website and you find this pledge drive for this debate. And the way it works is you pledge money if you would indeed like to see a debate between an Austrian economist and a Keynesian. And if the debate in fact occurs, then you have to actually pay the money. If it doesn't occur, you never have to pay a dime. And so he's already up to like $53,000 pledged. And his goal is, if we can at least get to 100,000, then it becomes difficult for Krugman not to debate. Not because Krugman would get the money, or my friend would get the money. The money is being pledged for food banks in New York to help the hungry. So if Krugman doesn't debate, what he's basically saying is that 1 hour of his time is not worth getting $100,000 to hungry people. Good luck with that. So he either becomes Paul Let Them Eat Cake Krugman, or if he consents to the debate, as one of my friends puts it, he runs into a buzzsaw and has his hat handed to him, his head handed to him by Murphy. So it's just a win-win. This thing is just super. So I'm going to start talking about what the substance of all this is, but I do want to urge you to jot down the domain name KrugmanDebate.com. That's Krugman, KrugmanDebate.com. You can go there and see what it's all about. There's a link to a very funny video that was made in anticipation of this debate. So please do that, because anything we can do to bring, our overlords down to our level and deign to talk to us is, I think, an advance for society. Okay. Well, when we talk about the Austrian school, we want to talk about Ludwig von Mises just for a minute. This is the guy after whom the Ludwig von Mises Institute that I worked for 4 years is named. Mises has this extraordinary life, so extraordinary that there is actually an old Batman comic that features Mises. This is no joke. We have this framed at the Mises Institute. I mean, you have so arrived. If even Batman is acknowledging your coolness and you're an economist, how could this be? And in fact, a lot of Austrians will actually ask things like, hey, who's your favorite economist? Like, wow, nobody thinks like this. Who's my favorite what? I mean, you might as well ask me, you know, who my favorite brain surgeon is. Like, how would I even know, right? But what they're saying is so compelling, people are just drawn to it. Well, Mises led quite an interesting life in the sense that he was in Vienna for quite some time. He made scholarly contributions there. He worked in the Chamber of Commerce. He was a professor. He was in Switzerland for a while, teaching in Geneva. And then he found, as the 1930s wore on, that he was living in a Europe that was not particularly congenial to a free market Jewish intellectual. Because obviously the Nazi Party was not preaching free market economics. Needless to say, free market economics is yet another scourge on mankind that the Jews have introduced, according to the Nazis. So this makes Mises stick out like a sore thumb. No, to the contrary, of course, what the Nazis favor is national self-sufficiency. They don't favor the international division of labor and all the things that Mises is talking about, international peace and relinquishing any claims of imperial conquest or anything like that. It's just the opposite of what the Nazis are teaching. So they confiscate his papers and library. He ultimately flees Europe with his wife. He arrives in the United States in 1940. In his late 50s, he would have been 59 at the time, almost empty-handed. Shows up in the U.S. And you think, all right, well, look, he's 59. He speaks some English, but, this is probably the end of his career. That's going to be it for this guy. And in fact, he has trouble finding a university position, paid university position. This is one of the most brilliant economists ever. This is at a time when, I'm not embellishing this is absolutely true, that Marxists and sort of quasi-Marxists are having no problems finding prominent chairs. He can't find anything. So he finally takes an unpaid university position at NYU. And it's a group of businessmen who, for the next 20 or so years, pay his salary to support his work. And it's in the decade of the 1940s, he produces 3 books. He produces his book, Omnipotent Government, his book, Bureaucracy, and then in 1949, he also produces a 900-page treatise on economics called Human Action. And if you look at Human Action, it's 900 pages without a single chart, graph, or equation. Wow, wait a minute, you mean economics is meant to be read by mere mortals? Who does this guy think he is? Doesn't he know economics is supposed to be impenetrable and impossible to understand? Well, that's why, when the Mises Institute found that we would bring out a brand new edition of Human Action, we found we had some old copies of the previous edition. We announced on the website, hey, we got 80 copies of the old edition. We're selling them for $15 if anybody wants them. The website crashed from people saying, good thing this hadn't been in a brick and mortar store. People would have been crushed to death trying to get a 900-page treatise on economics, published by Yale University Press. Quite extraordinary. And we contrast this, and I say this not to say that all other economists are stupid idiots doing nonsense. I'm not saying that. But it is worth noting how many people read Human Action even 60 years later. How many people read the typical article in the American Economic Review? That's the main professional journal. How many people read it? The answer is, they did a survey on this. You know how many people read the typical article in the American Economic Review? 2.5. 2.5 people. So once you get rid of the editor and the author, you're down to like a half a guy running around reading. Because, of course, it is impossible to understand. It's all jargon, it's all math, and this is supposed to indicate how human society works. Mises would have none of that. This is just the process of ratiocination that we need to engage in here. So Mises goes on, continuing to teach, totally unfazed by his lack of prestige, dies in 1973, and then his colleague Hayek, who had basically learned the business cycle theory from him, wins the Nobel Prize the year after Mises dies and doesn't live to see it. But up to the last, Mises just continued on to fight and now said, hey, we've got a whole new generation of students who are studying from him and consulting his old book to figure out what's going on. Now, when a guy like Peter Schiff, who's a broker, an investment analyst, a commentator, and an author, a guy like Peter Schiff in 2006 is talking about the housing bubble and is talking to mortgage dealers themselves and telling them that, look, the bottom's going to fall out, and here's why. People take notice. Who is this guy? How did he know this was going to happen? Is he always predicting doom, and so he just happened to be right this time? Or is it that he had tarot cards, and he just flipped one, and it was the death card, and so he knew, aha, the crash is coming? How did he know? And hence now, we had a case in 2008 when one of the most frequently searched for terms in Google was Austrian freaking economics. Well, I added one word to that, but nevertheless, just for emphasis. But this, I mean, none of us ever expected that this sort of thing would happen. The Mises Institute even produces T-shirts with economists on them, which is a little freaky. Even freakier is they sell. People buy these. My own wife said to me, now look, you know, you're a wonderful husband. You've done many, many wonderful things for the family. But there are certain things that cannot go on under this roof. And one of them is you owning more than 3 of these shirts. I mean, that is really intimate. You can pick the 3 economists you like, and then that as far as this wife is going to go. So, all right, fair enough, fair enough. I can get the rule is I can get a new one, but I have to get rid of one. It's a one-on-one. It can only be 3 at once. All right. Anyway, let's moving on. So, what is it they're talking about in particular that's relevant to us today? Well, again, business side theory. When we talk about business side, we're talking about how come the economy seems to be doing great. Everybody's doing great. We're all flipping houses. And it seems great. And then everybody's sort of in the toilet. You know, like why is everything turned down? And then it's up again and down again. Why is that? This has occupied the scholarly attention of a great many people because it's a good question. Why? Why does this happen? And there were Marxian answers to this question, that this is based on deep inherent contradictions in the free market economy. There are psychological explanations that, well, investors are just moved by animal spirits, and sometimes they feel good, and sometimes they feel pessimistic, and it's arbitrary, there's no way to anticipate it, and these sorts of animal spirits drive the business cycle. Well, Hayek and the Austrians would have none of this. They want to know what real factors in the real world are accounting for why we observe this phenomenon. So what I want to do is just give you the brief, quickie overview, especially since some of you guys probably already know this. But still, we all need to learn something about this idea. That, as I think for reasons you'll see, is indeed attracting a lot of attention and interest and curiosity these days. And basically, in order to explain this, we begin with a question. And the question is, this is a question that was posed by a British economist, Lionel Robbins, in his great overlooked book, The Great Depression, that he wrote in 1934. In the middle of the Depression, he wants to know what is going on. Why have we had a crash of such severity? And the question as he poses it is, why is there a cluster of error? In other words, why are businesses all making losses in a cluster? Like, why wouldn't the losses be just spread out over time? Why are there a whole bunch of losses all at once? Why would they be bunched up like this? Particularly since what the free market does is it weeds out people who are poor entrepreneurs. If you're not good at anticipating consumer demand, you make losses, and you may eventually have to go out of business, and your resources get shifted to new owners. Whereas if you are indeed good at anticipating consumer demand, you make profits, you expand, you get control over more resources, and you're doing great. So the market selects for you, and selects against people who aren't so good at this. So at any given time, the market is selecting for the most skilled entrepreneurs. So why should these people in particular, all of a sudden, why should they all have failed to anticipate whatever difficulties they ran into? Why? Why the cluster of error?